week 2 of the Portal Quilt Sew-Along, and I hope you all are doing okay and surviving this crazy world that we're living in right now. Okay, and maybe getting time to spend with family that you don't see very often. Hope you're making the best of it and hope you're feeling okay. Let's get to making something. So week 1 last week, we went over how to read the Portal Quilt pattern and how to choose your fabrics and what you needed to make this quilt. It's week 2 now, and we're going to talk about cutting fabrics. So I'm very glad that you're here. If you are just jumping into the Portal Sew-Along, never fear. I've got a link below if you're watching on YouTube where you can go to where all of the Portal Sew-Along information lives on my website. You can go to that anytime and you can watch last week's video. Some of you were posting fabric pulls from last week, and I really love seeing those. So if you pull fabric at any point to get ready for this sew-along, make sure and tag it, hashtag Portal Quilt Sew-Along, and you can also tag it Wisecraft Portal, which I think a lot of people are doing. And also tag me in the photo at Blair S if you're on Instagram. If you're in our Facebook group, Wisecraft Quilts Facebook group, you can put a picture in there. And also wherever you post pictures online, feel free to post. It's fun to see what everybody is choosing to make their own portal quilt. So before we get to this week's task, I wanted to address a couple of questions that we had last week that I wanted to make sure that I addressed. So one of the questions was, I am using quilting cottons for some of my scraps or for some of my choices, and I'm also using older vintage or secondhand fabrics. Do I need to pre-wash all of those together? I'm worried about differences in shrinking in the final quilt, and that's a good question. So here's my own personal rule. I'm not a pre-washer, mainly because I don't have the time to pre-wash all of my fabrics. And clearly I have never run into a problem with shrinkage differences, or else I would have become a pre-washer. So what I would suggest is that if you're using something like clothing that you're cutting up or something like that, that's been washed likely several times, so don't worry about pre-washing that. Quilting cottons on the market today shrink very little. Manufacturers have refined their processes to have very predictable results when their fabrics are washed, in the idea of less shrinkage and no color bleeding. So you don't need to worry about that. And you don't need to worry about combining those types of secondhand fabrics with your quilting cottons. If you're using batiks, those can sometimes be a little unpredictable. You may want to pre-wash those. I don't use a lot of batiks, but my understanding is that a lot of people who use strictly batiks often pre-wash them, just because they're hand-dyed and can have some surprises once in a while in the final project. If you're using vintage pieces, vintage feed sack cloth, or any sort of vintage fabric that you have that you're not sure of the fiber content or how color fast it is, go ahead and pre-wash that. Pre-wash it however you would envision washing the final quilt. So if you think a final quilt would be washed on the gentle cycle in warm or cool water and machine dried or air dried. Just take that into consideration. Pre-wash your vintage fabrics, because honestly, we don't know if they have been washed or how they've been washed. So it's a good idea to pre-wash those. If they bleed or shrink a lot, you would much rather that happen now versus when you cut it to go into your quilt. And the other question I wanted to address is how scrappy should this quilt be? Now, obviously, I made the original quilt using all the prints in one designer quilting cotton line from Ruby Star. Typically, I make my value quilts out of only scraps. So it's a fun exercise for me to see if I can make it out of an entire fat quarter set from one designer versus all scraps. So usually I make mine out of scraps that I pull from my stash. When I make scrappy versions of these quilts, I always say the more options you have, the better. So if you decided to make a green scrappy portal quilt and you wanted to do just greens, then you would want to have at least 20, I would say 15 to 20 different options of greens that you could then divide by value. If you are making a completely scrappy quilt, you will probably see success in the look of your quilt using about at least that many scraps, but if not more. I always leave room for more scraps. More scraps in quilts that rely on value tell a better story. If you use fewer options for prints and colors and things like that, it may still work, but it does not have nearly the excitement that a very scrappy version of this has. So I guess you could look at it as you're designing a quilt, you're designing a value quilt, and to tell that value story, you need lots of different fabrics that fall into those value categories that you've chosen. So if any of you have questions that you are unsure about when it comes to your fabric pulls, just ask me. Leave a comment on the YouTube video, on IGTV, wherever you watch this video, and I'm happy to help you along with it. So hopefully that answered some questions. So let's get to cutting. That's this week's assignment. And I'm going to show you how to stay organized when you're cutting, how to sort of set up your space. If you're using the Stellar fabric from Ruby Star Society, as I used in the original cover quilt of the pattern, inside I have a sheet that tells you how much of each print from the Stellar line to cut for this quilt to make the version that I made on the cover. So you would follow that if you're using those fabrics. Now, if you're using different fabrics, then let's talk about how you would cut them. We are on step A in the instructions, and I, again, am going to make two versions of this quilt. Both will be throw sized. So I know from past experience of making this quilt that I'm going to need 20 to 22 different fat quarters to make a quilt with a lot of good variety. So last week I showed you my two fabrics that I pulled together for each of my two versions and how I divided them into light, medium, and dark value. As I said last week, and as I'll say again this week, these value decisions that you make initially are not cast in stone, and likely some of the things in each stack will switch to a different stack. Don't worry about that. We make these initial value decisions just to sort of give us a guideline to make sure that we have enough fabrics that the pattern calls for and enough variety. Here you see in front of me, I have all of the fabrics for my scrappy version that I'm making. These are all fabrics that I've been saving from August Wren's different collections. And I'm going to use all of them together in one scrappy quilt or one scrappy version of the Portal. And I also did a version using Anagram's Drift List collection. So I have opened up these fat quarters, I have pressed them all out, and now I'm ready to cut. Let's talk about cutting. I've kind of roughly got these divided into the light value stack and the medium value stack, and then at the very bottom I have the darkest ones for the center squares. So I'm going to take the ones that are not for the center squares and put those aside for just a minute. Take the ones that are for the center squares and put those aside for just a minute, and let's look at the light valued ones. Now the good thing about this pattern is that you need 10-inch squares both from your light value and your medium value, which is great because if you cut a 10-inch square from your light value stack, decide later in the construction process that you want to make that a medium value, you don't have to recut anything. It's already cut. So normally what I do is I will take 2 at a time. So I've got 2 fat quarters here, and I line up their selvages together. And I usually put it on my right side. Doesn't really matter, but since I'm right-handed and I cut from my left side, I usually do it that way. So I've got the selvages lined up here. Oh, and one thing I will say is that all fat quarters are not always cut the same. Some are a little generous, some are a little not so generous. So what you're always going to want to do if you're cutting 2 at a time, like I'm going to do, is you always want to, if there is one that is a little smaller than the other one, so in this example, this top one here is a little smaller overall than the bottom one. So I'm going to make sure I put that one on the top. That way when I'm cutting, I know that I'm getting both of them. So you're going to want a nice sharp blade in your rotary cutter. And what I normally do is I'll line up the selvages, and I'm just going to find a line on my rotary mat to sort of get those aligned, just because I like to keep things nice and neat. And then so to cut the 10-inch squares that I need from the light valued fabric, I've got my 15 by 15 inch square ruler, and you can tell I use this guy a lot because I have a great big hunk cut out of it. So what I'm going to do is cut a 10-inch square here and a 10-inch square here. Now I have cut a lot of these, and I have found that this is the best way to make the most use of the fat quarter, and as a bonus I still have some up here that I could fold up and use for another project. Because this edge of the fat quarter is likely not square, I'm going to cut my first square here about 10 1/4. So I have the 10-inch line here just above. If you can see that, I've got the bottom edge at about 10 1/4, and then I have this side at roughly 10 1/4. So I'm going to make my first cut across like that. Pull that away. And then, not tugging too much on this fabric, I'm going to make my second cut. And this time I'm going to line the 10-inch line up with the very edge of the fabric on both sides so that I am making a clean cut for a 10-inch square. All right. So now I've cut 2 10-inch squares of my light value. So I'm going to set those over there. Now I need to cut 2 more. So this time I can align this one at 10 inches. I still want to go to 10 1/4 on this bottom edge because again it is not straight. So I'm going to line it up. Oops. Shifted it a little bit. And there we go. So now I just need to cut this one edge here and straighten that one up. So for this cut, I have this side aligned with the 10-inch mark, this side aligned with the 10-inch mark, and the top side aligned with the 10-inch mark. And I'm just going to cut off the edge. And now I've got 2 of these 2. So I'll put those aside. And now I've got all of this left for another project. So what I typically do is just cut this off, and unless you're a selvage saver and you want to cut the whole selvage off, I would do that. And then I fold these and store them with my other blue fabrics like this, because these are great scraps for a future scrappy quilt. So let's do that again, and this time we'll do it with our dark valued fabrics. This is the selvage over here, and I'm going to line this, which is actually a little less than a fat quarter because I used it in a different project. I'm going to line that selvage over there as well. I'm going to do the same thing, 2 10-inch squares from each print. So looks like you want to, cut off as little as possible to square it up. So it looks like I can align the 10 1/4, maybe even like the 10 1/8 to get that to square up. So I'm going to make my first cut. Flip it around and finish the other 2 sides of the 10-inch square. Okay, I've got those. So see, I cut 2 of the medium valued from those, and now I'm going to cut 2 more, and it looks like these shifted just a little bit, so I'm going to line those back up. And this time I can align this 10-inch side, cut a little bit over 10 inches at the bottom, so like 10 1/8 seems to be doing it on this one. So 10 inches along there and 1/4. Just to be sure. And then square up that last edge there. So I've got 10, I've got it on the 10-inch line here, on the 10-inch line here, on the 10-inch line here, and I'm just going to square off that top. So now I have 2 10-inch medium squares. So here's something I want to bring up. I've now cut all my 10-inch squares for my light and medium value, and I've got them all laid out here. These are more light in value than these, at least at this stage. And I'm looking at this one. This one feels really dark to me. And I'm sort of second guessing whether I would call that a medium value or actually a dark value. And I'll show you, just for reference, here are the ones that I pulled aside for the dark value, the center squares. And I was thinking that I would also use this one as one of the center squares. But now I'm thinking that I might actually use this fabric and then maybe cut 10-inch squares from this one for my medium value square. Now, that is an example of why in my patterns I have you cut the larger sizes first. So I've cut my 10-inch squares from this fabric. If I want to recut this into 4-inch squares, I can still do it. I haven't ruined my ability to use this fabric. So important to keep in mind. Also important to just follow the sequential steps in the pattern so that you don't miscut. So I think what I'll do is I'll cut these into 4-inch squares. When I say these, I mean the two 10-inch squares from this one particular print. I think I might cut this one into two 10-inch squares. I had this one in kind of a maybe pile too, so I think I might cut this one into medium value squares, and that'll give me 3 different prints for the center squares. And I do believe I need at least 3. If you were making a quilt larger than a throw size, I would suggest more than 3. You can repeat the 4-inch squares. You can repeat prints in those squares, but you want variety. It really looks better if you've got plenty of variety. So I have 3 for my throw size quilt. If you were doing a larger, like a king size quilt, I would have at least 6 or 7. So just use your own discretion. It's your design. If you decide you want all of the centers of your quilt the same, you can do that too. And for this particular cut, I'm going to use this ruler, which is 6 inches by 12 inches. I like having a ruler that sort of works well with the size of piece that I'm cutting, because if I use the square ruler that I used for the 10-inch squares, you can absolutely use that, but it's just a little unwieldy. This one is a lot easier to use, but if you only have the square ruler, you use what you have. It certainly works. So again, I'm going to find a line on my ruler, a line on my rotary mat, just to square up the edge and make a clean cut through both layers. And then if I need 10, I know that if this is a 21-inch side, then hypothetically I can get 5 different 4-inch squares out of one strip. Is that right? Let's try it. So I'm going to line this side up with the 4-inch line, but at the same time I'm going to line up the fold with the line on my ruler and make a 4-inch cut. And then I'm going to make another 4-inch cut the exact same way. 4-inch line here, finding a straight reference point down here. And now to subcut these, I'm going to lay this out, and I'm just using the lines on my rotary cutting mat just for reference. So I'm going to line up the 2 selvages over here because I'm right-handed. Again, this time I'm lining the top edge with my rotary mat. I'm going to slice off these selvage edges. So I'm just finding a straight line. This one here aligns to the straight line reference point on the mat. And you want to cut off as little as possible. So now let's go across this. So with this ruler, I can either measure 4 inches in this way, or I can measure it in this way, holding the ruler this way. I'm going to do it this way. So that's 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. And then to bring up is fussy cutting. The centers of the individual blocks where you have color C, the dark value, that is a great area to fussy cut something if you would like to do that. And I have seen a couple of instances where people have done a really nice job of that. I often use my ruby ruler as a viewfinder. so that what I can do is look at this fabric, decide which of these cute kitties I want, and then the ruby ruler measures 5 by 5, so I only need a 4 by 4. So then what I would do is sort of get that kitty centered. What I would do in this case is, I probably can't see this, I would use a chalk pencil, which I can't find one right now, but I'm lining this kitty up kind of in the center of this square, and then I would just draw lines to the 4-inch mark on these sides, and then I would turn it around, line the 2 4-inch lines up there and there. Now we're going to subcut the 10-inch squares, and this is super easy to do. I'm going to show you how I do it, and what I would recommend is that if you are at all uncertain about this cut that we're about to make, do one layer at a time. But if you have cut this way before, feel free to double up, and if you have a sharp blade. In order to make these guys here, we're going to need to take each one of these squares and cut it diagonally in half in both directions. Now, why do we do this? This is a little bit of a lesson on bias. You know that if you pull your fabric against the straight of grain, you don't get a lot of pull. It just does not stretch a lot. If you pull it in the cross grain side, you get a little bit of pull, but not a lot. If you pull on the bias, which is diagonal, you get the most pull. So the most stretch. So you don't want stretch to come into play on your quilts. When you're making these individual blocks here, you don't want your stretchy sides to be on the outsides of these blocks. You want your stretchy side to always be on the inside of the blocks. So that's why we cut the 10-inch squares, and then we're going to subcut them. So I'm using a 3-inch by 18-inch ruler, just something long enough to stretch from one side to the other. And what I like to do is, when I'm making these cuts, is I anchor my rotary cutter at one corner, right in the very center corner, align the ruler, and then eyeball the opposite corner. Cut it, and then without moving the square, come to this side and do the same thing. And then what you get is 4 triangles, but the long edge, which is always going to be the outside edge of your block, in every case, does not have stretch. All of the stretch is in the inside, which is what you want. So you're going to cut all of your blocks, your 10-inch blocks, exactly the same way. as you can see, believe it or not, I have all my pieces cut to make my quilt. The only thing I have left to do is I'm going to cut these two and put these in the medium value pile. That may shift a couple of these over to the light value pile, but we'll see. So that's your assignment for this week, to stay on track. When you have some time, organize your fabric for this quilt, start cutting your squares, and start subcutting your squares diagonally in either direction, and set up your space to get ready to sew next week. What I did want to say is that if you are at home and you want to jump ahead and go ahead and complete more than what I'm asking you to complete this week, that is completely fine. We are all at home, and if you're on a creative jaunt and you don't want to stop, by all means, please keep on creating and making the most of this time. I hope you guys stay healthy and stay safe, and I will see you here next week. Thanks for tuning in.